In the dark and turbulent years leading up to World War II, an organization emerged from the shadows with a sinister and ambitious purpose: the Hitler Youth. Born out of nationalist fervor and the relentless propaganda of the Third Reich, these youth ranks became the beating heart of Nazi ideology. With a disturbing blend of military discipline and ideological indoctrination, the Hitler Youth aspired to create a loyal generation, ready to sacrifice everything for the distorted vision of an Aryan future, dreaming of a resplendent and all-powerful Germania. The camaraderie forged in these environments not only cemented loyalty to the Führer, but also sowed the seeds of hatred towards those considered enemies of the Reich. As the war erupted across Europe, the Hitler Youth transcended their original purpose, becoming soldiers of a destructive ideology. The relentless 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitler Jugend, formed by these young individuals, was thrown into the battlefield, facing a world they were only beginning to understand. As Baldur von Schirach, leader of the Hitler Youth, once said, "I have built a youth before whom the world will retreat." Join us to explore the formidable history of the Hitler Youth, delve into the dark corners of their indoctrination, and understand the devastating impact they left on world history. Welcome to Leonardo da Vinci's Tales, the initial path of the Hitler Youth, the march towards devotion. The forward march of the Hitler Youth formally begins in the year 1926. This militia of adolescents is born out of the need to indoctrinate and gather troops to defend the country from future threats, as well as a long-term investment to form a group with a common thought or ideal in power. The aim was to instill three fundamental values of the party: loyalty to Hitler, racial supremacy, and preparation for war. Before the program's inception, there existed a culture of scouts influenced by the British, promoting outdoor experiences, teamwork, and community service. Faced with the need for a strictly trained army for future conflicts, the idea of holding scout camps was born, to slowly escalate into a militia with the same ideals of the party and the same hatred for Germany's enemies. At the outset, the Hitler Youth was poorly organized, with few members, and even the ideas were nil as to what could be done besides indoctrinating children with the Nazi ideal. To address all these needs, the Nazi Party selected Baldur von Schirach as its leader. Von Schirach was a prominent party activist and a devout follower of the Führer from the early days, being an active member since the 1920s. His rapid rise was due to his commitment and charisma, fundamental qualities for connecting with the Hitler Youth. In 1931, he was appointed leader of the Reich Youth, and the following year he took command of the youth militia. Over time, Schirach demonstrated organizational and leadership skills by structuring the Hitler Youth into a more formal organization with a more defined and developed structure. Under his leadership, programs and activities were dictated for its members. Schirach also actively promoted Nazi ideology among young people, fostering loyalty to Hitler, extreme nationalism, and rejection of the regime's enemies. The recruitment method employed by both the director and the party not only involved convincing interested young people, but also persuading their parents, who had to accept the absence of their children for several days and even weeks while participating in camp activities. Once parents granted their trust, the party did everything possible to ensure that young people believed in and unconditionally obeyed the Führer's orders. Although the external perception of the Hitler Youth could raise criticisms or concerns, many parents saw no problem in sending their children to these camps. In fact, some fully shared the ideologies of the Nazi Party and considered it positive for their children to be indoctrinated in them, as long as they could also enjoy sports activities, come into contact with nature, and socialize with other children. This acceptance by certain parents was based on their affinity with the political principles of the regime, which led them to view positively the ideological training their children received in the Hitler Youth. That was the point at first, since by 1926 Hitler had not yet ascended to power. For that, he had to wait a few more years. With Hitler's rise to power in 1933, the influence and reach of the Hitler Youth expanded exponentially. By 1932, a year before Hitler became Chancellor of Germany, the youth militia had 108,000 members. However, with the advent of the Nazi regime and its intense propaganda campaign, this number skyrocketed significantly. By 1940, at the height of the regime, the Hitler Youth had grown to an impressive 8.7 million members, becoming one of the most powerful militias of the time. Over the years, more and more teenagers wanted to prove their worth in sports and complex exercises, and many of them took pride in wearing the militia uniform. They soon realized that being there gave them social benefits and respect in their community. To incentivize even more, the propaganda ministry produced films highlighting the Hitler Youth, showcasing their achievements, activities, and above all, the physical and facial ideals that all Germans were expected to aspire to. These films not only impacted the national community, but also caught the attention of the international community, which was concerned about how a generation of children was being prepared for war. As the Nazis consolidated their dominance, they further integrated the Hitler Youth into the state structure, thus consolidating their influence on German youth and their role in society. In 1936, all other youth organizations in Germany were dissolved and absorbed by the Hitler Youth, making it the only legal youth organization in the country. Forging the youth of the Third Reich. Between training camps and ideological indoctrination. Training in the camps of the Hitler Youth took place in various locations, mostly in rural and wooded areas that provided ample space for outdoor activities. These places included open fields, mountains, and areas near rivers or lakes, recreating environments that faithfully emulated the scenarios where battles would take place during World War II. The capacity of these camps to accommodate young people varied widely, from hundreds to thousands of members. The Hitler Youth subjected its members to strenuous exercises, carefully designed to strengthen both the body and mind of the young. These activities included long-distance marches carrying heavy backpacks, challenges that promoted not only physical endurance but also discipline and teamwork among participants. During these marches, teenagers walked along routes that could extend up to 20 kilometers while carrying loads of up to 8 kilograms in their backpacks. The young members of the Hitler Youth participated in a wide variety of sports, from the most popular such as football and athletics, to more specialized disciplines such as archery and horse riding. One of the highlights of this instruction was weapons training. The youth learned to handle rifles, pistols, and other firearms under the supervision of specialized instructors. They were taught how to clean, load, and shoot weapons correctly, as well as basic combat tactics and patrol maneuvers. Weapons training was fundamental for the Hitler Youth, as it allowed them to familiarize themselves with military equipment and prepared them for possible roles in the army, as the most skilled could be transferred to the SS. Through regular practice sessions, young people gained confidence in their ability to handle firearms safely and effectively. Weapons training not only covered the technical aspects, but also had a crucial psychological component. It taught them to remain calm under pressure and to act fearlessly on the battlefield. Additionally, hand-to-hand combat exercises, personal defense practices, and combat drills were carried out. In the early years, everything seemed to have a naive tone, but as the Nazi Party consolidated its power in all areas of the nation, things began to change, and gradually the organization of the Hitler Youth revealed its true face and its real objective. The Nazi regime sought to completely eliminate other ethnic minorities that they considered contrary to the supposed Aryan gene, a term used by the Führer to promote his evolutionary vision of humanity, in which other races were considered to be in development, while the Germans were at the pinnacle of evolution. To carry out this brutal enterprise, the Third Reich built concentration camps designed to systematically imprison and eliminate Jews, claiming the lives of an estimated 5 to 6 million victims. Additionally, the Nazi regime also dedicated itself to eliminating hundreds of thousands of Roma, while trying to increase the birth rate of the Aryan population. The Nazis yearned to demonstrate to the world the supposed physical and aesthetic superiority of the German people, promoting the idea that they possessed the intelligence and physical capabilities necessary to be perfect on the battlefield. With this goal in mind, the Nazi regime sought to create a group of super soldiers, idealized as the ultimate embodiment of the Aryan race. For the British and Americans, this story seemed like something out of a science fiction movie, but this was the reality under Hitler's immense power. They upheld the concept of genetic superiority so strongly that they even eliminated those who posed a threat to future generations. The treatment of weak children, those with disabilities or mental problems, was a burden to the state. For that reason, specific programs were implemented to carry out euthanasia in this group of minorities. Thus emerged the program known as Action T4, tasked with carrying out euthanasia on thousands of patients residing in hospitals and medical centers who suffered from various physical and mental disabilities. From its inception in 1939 until the end of the war, this sinister initiative ended the lives of approximately 300,000 innocent people in a cruel and ruthless act that reflected the brutality of the Nazi regime. There were other programs of the Nazi government that crossed all understandable limits, such as carrying out forced sterilizations on those people who possessed supposed undesirable genetics for the country, when unions between Aryan Germans and Jews arose, something that was strictly prohibited. The Hitler Youth were not just a militia. They were the plan to completely Germanize Germany and abandon any other type of genetics that did not respect Aryan traits, such as white skin, blue eyes, blonde hair, height, and specific physical constitution, among other common characteristics of Germans. Adolf Hitler himself, in an act before a crowd of young people, recited aloud the following speech. "For me, a young German must be slim and agile, as fast as a greyhound, tough as leather, and hard as steel." In the Third Reich, all demands had to be respected by all citizens, including children. Members of this organization were indoctrinated to hate and confront other ethnicities. From the age of 14, they were taught that communists were considered demons, just like the Jews, whom they blamed for the country's ruin. With early developing minds, they believed everything the adults told them because Nazi propaganda was the only information available to them. Dark times. The cruel reality of the Hitler Youth. During Hitler's regime, a dark aspect was the treatment received by those who did not meet the physical aptitudes necessary to fulfill the exercises in the Hitler Youth camps. Nobody showed compassion for thin and weak teenagers. Those who could not follow the training due to physical weakness or other limitations could face different types of consequences. While there is no direct evidence that they suffered systematic bullying, some may have faced social pressure or discrimination for not being able to meet the required physical standards. In a regime so focused on the ideology of physical superiority and preparation for war, those who could not fully participate in training activities were seen as a burden to the organization. This could have resulted in forms of social ostracism, discrimination, or even deliberate exclusions from certain activities within the militia. The organization had completely dissociated itself from the similarities with the Scouts, so it had become a militia, and the way of treatment became radically different, colder, and more demanding. In some cases, the leaders of the camps, those who were supposed to be in charge of the children, were harsh and did not care about provoking insults towards those who were unable to carry out a military exercise. There were also women within the Hitler Youth, and the female section of this organization was called the League of German Girls. In contrast to men, the role of women within the organization focused on traditional gender roles and preparing for their future role as wives and mothers in the Third Reich Germany. They also received ideological training and participated in patriotic and community activities, but their training did not focus as much on military aspects as that of men. Women were instructed in skills considered more appropriate for their gender within the Nazi context, such as sewing, cooking, homemaking, and childcare. The difference in training reflected the Nazi regime's view of gender roles and the division of labor between men and women in society. While men were trained to be soldiers and defenders of the fatherland, women learned to be obedient wives and dedicated mothers, thus contributing to the maintenance and propagation of the Nazi ideal of family and community. From a modern perspective, this may be seen as something vile and dark, but it should be noted that some women within the organization were able to find a sense of purpose and community, and some even enjoyed certain privileges or benefits provided by their affiliation with the Nazi regime. Women's participation in the Hitler Youth also had broader implications in Nazi society. By promoting a conservative and patriarchal view of family and gender, the Third Reich sought to reinforce its control over the population and foster conformity with its political and social ideals. Women were considered guardians of tradition and morality, and they were taught to value their role in the home and child rearing as a vital contribution to the welfare of the German nation. Despite the restrictions imposed by the regime, some women within the Hitler Youth found ways of resistance and autonomy. Through solidarity with other women and mutual support, they were able to challenge gender norms and seek greater freedom and autonomy within the limits imposed by the system, which were not few. However, these forms of resistance were difficult and risky, as the Nazi regime exerted strict control over all aspects of public and private life, including a rejection of anything that threatened the idea of family tradition, which was eliminated. Those young people with homosexual orientation within the Hitler Youth and in Nazi Germany in general faced strict prohibition and severe reprisals simply because of their sexual orientation. The Nazi regime promoted an extremely conservative view of sexuality, emphasizing heterosexuality as the only acceptable sexual behavior and promoting reproduction as a duty to the nation. The higher the birth rate grew, the larger the Nazi army would be in later years. Homosexuals were persecuted and considered a threat to the supposed purity and strength of the Aryan race. In the Hitler Youth, any hint of homosexuality among members was severely punished, and those identified as such faced social ostracism, harassment, and exclusion from the organization. In Nazi Germany, many of them were arrested, imprisoned, and even killed in concentration camps. It was not difficult to remain within this militia since most of them were young. They had to behave like adults, perform adult tasks, and restrict themselves to a dozen desires, suffering impositions by the state. Some children decided to leave the Hitler Youth camps for various reasons. Among them were discontent with the training conditions, rejection of Nazi ideology, or the desire to be with their families. In addition, some young people may have experienced physical or emotional difficulties during training, leading them to make the decision to leave. The repercussions for children who made the decision to leave the camp could be severe. The state could also take indirect reprisals, such as excluding certain social or educational benefits for deserters and their families, or denying job or education opportunities in the future. In some cases, deserters could be subjected to physical reprisals or intimidation by members of the Nazi Party or the Hitler Youth themselves. These reprisals aimed to discourage desertion and reinforce social control over German youth during the Nazi regime. The Dark Night of Broken Glass. The horrific Nazi discrimination. Hitler and his cabinet, especially the Minister of Propaganda Joseph Goebbels, were experts in mass manipulation. They began to implement political, cultural, and social strategies to gain the support of the majority of the population. One of these strategies was to identify a common enemy. Since Hitler's rise to power in 1933, systematic discrimination against Jews was planned, using both civil society to foster hatred and the power of the state to implement anti-Semitic laws. One of the most ferocious confrontations against this minority community was the event known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. The night of November 9, 1938, was one of the darkest, especially for Jewish merchants who suffered attacks on their businesses, arson, and even escalated to murders. Its name comes from the fact that citizens' number one goal was to shatter the windows of Jewish businesses, so society would know where not to buy, because they were already marked. This action was carried out as a boycott method against Jewish commerce, driven by the state. To use Jews as a scapegoat for Germany's problems, they began to promote the idea that Jews had an undue control over national trade and banks. Although these theories lacked solid foundations, society was so saturated with anti-Semitic propaganda that it ended up believing them. This sparked the anger of a crowd eager to find someone to blame for the problems afflicting Germany, thus sowing hatred in the population. Around 91 Jews died in this incentivized violence, and it was carried out with the intention of removing this community from public life, being the first step of the following ones to eradicate Jews from the country. During these brutal acts, not only civilians participated, but also Nazi paramilitary forces, including the Hitler Youth. It was common to see young people committing acts of vandalism in the streets, throwing stones at synagogues and businesses, and even at the homes of people of Jewish origin. They marched in groups to urge other German citizens not to buy from Jewish businesses, with the aim of boycotting the future economic of this community. Brainwashing began at an early age, and under Hitler's totalitarian regime, it was difficult to have a different perspective. Due to systematic state indoctrination, everyone mistreated and humiliated Jews, with the Night of Broken Glass event being a turning point that foreshadowed the Holocaust. Tensions between German civilians, paramilitary groups and Jews began several years before the 1938 conflict. 5 years earlier, the Nazis implemented a law to expel Jews from jobs in the civil service, meaning that non-Aryan Jews could not hold positions in the government, education, and other public institutions. In 1935, the government enacted the controversial Law for the Protection of German Blood and German Honor, which legalized racial discrimination against Jews. This law also prohibited marriages and sexual relations between Aryan Germans and Jews, with the intention of preserving supposed genetic purity. After years of being under the mental control of Nazi propaganda and being born into an environment that instilled hatred without justification beyond that dictated by the Führer, by 1938, many Germans shared these anti-Semitic ideas. However, not everyone supported these acts. Some Germans were not exposed to propaganda so intensely or simply did not believe in it, and therefore opposed carrying out these actions. Nevertheless, expressing their disapproval openly could bring trouble, so many chose to remain silent. The path of the Hitler Youth: preparation for conflict and national duty. Soon, the Hitler Youth would prepare to put into practice on the battlefield the war tactics they had been perfecting for years. In 1939, as the German economy experienced a resurgence, Hitler's figure rose with increasingly consolidated power. After suffering the recession left by the Great War in the 1930s, the economy began to recover thanks to a series of economic measures promoted by the Nazi Party, including the creation of infrastructures such as highways, the activation of heavy industry, and the rearmament of the army, which promoted full employment. Like all tyrants, desires for invasion and plunder of other nations began to emerge, and Poland was chosen to be the first official invasion of the Third Reich, one of many that followed. On September 1, 1939, German armed forces led under Hitler's power surprised Poland with a blitzkrieg invasion, using air, land, and sea forces to instantly neutralize the enemy. Hitler's justification for invading this nation was that during World War I, under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to abandon Polish territories. When those territories were ceded, the treaty also ordered the transfer of territories belonging to Germany, so Hitler sought to recover those lands and meanwhile keep all of Poland. This invasion was widely condemned by the international community, fearing that a subsequent invasion could be triggered due to the growing military power of the Nazis in potential and effectiveness. After the rapid victory in Poland, which lasted only 17 days, the Hitler Youth were even more imbued with nationalist fervor and a sense of purpose. Nazi propaganda was so effective that young people were taught that the invasion of Poland was because that nation had plenty of empty space to populate. Due to Poland's opposition to this plan, the Germans had to remove any obstacles in the way of expanding the new empire. For many young Germans, the rapid conquest of Poland served as validation of Nazi ideology and their role in society. It also sought to portray the invasion as an act of historical justice, reclaiming territories they considered legitimately German, such as areas of East Prussia and the Silesia region. The latter was recognized for its prosperous mining industry, especially in coal and iron, crucial natural resources for the country's industrial and military development. In addition, control over these territories allowed Germany to expand its access to raw materials and strengthen its economic and industrial base. It was a dark time for the Hitler Youth because once the war began, they had to participate in various tasks during the conflict. There are documented cases of young people between the ages of 14 and 18 who were forced to participate in battle. Although it was not widespread practice, the shortage of soldiers fit for fighting on the front lines forced young people to take on this task. If they did not do this, they helped in other ways, such as performing tasks like messengers, logistics aides, civil defense, and other non-combatant functions. During these years, the most important thing for the Third Reich was to prevent the advance of Allied forces at any cost. No one could refuse to participate in the conflict, and the Nazi Party had designed everything so that this would not happen. When affiliation with this organization became mandatory in 1936 under the Reich Youth Law, those who refused to join risked their parents being sanctioned and could even face the possibility of imprisonment. The Nazi regime exerted great social pressure on families to comply with established laws and policies. Among the testimonies about the pressure to join the Hitler Youth during the Nazi regime, the account of the German writer Sebastian Haffner in his work History of a German stands out. Haffner describes how enrollment in the Hitler Youth became mandatory, causing tensions in German families. He himself initially resisted, but his father's concern about the potential family repercussions ultimately persuaded him. His testimony illustrates how the obligation to join the Hitler Youth not only posed risks for young people, but also tensions within families facing the regime's pressure. Youth in the trenches, the rise and fall of the 12th SS Panzer Division. In relation to the young people belonging to the Hitler Youth who participated in the war, there are particular cases that stand out in history, such as that of the 12th SS Panzer Division. This military unit was one of the most unique and disturbing of the Third Reich, mostly formed by teenagers. This division was created in 1943 when the Nazi regime, facing increasing pressure from the Allies, decided to turn to its most fervently indoctrinated youth to strengthen its armed forces. Those who showed stronger ideological and physical commitment were selected to receive more intensive military training, similar to what the young members of the 12th SS Panzer Division received. The core of this division consisted of teenagers aged between 16 and 18, who, under the command of experienced Waffen-SS officers, prepared to face the worst aspects of war. One of the most significant moments for this division was its participation in the Battle of Normandy in June 1944. After the Allied landing on the beaches of Normandy, the division was sent to the front to counter the advance of British and Canadian forces. Despite their youth, the soldiers fought with a tenacity and ferocity that surprised their enemies, reflecting both their indoctrination and their desperate defense of the Third Reich. The reality of combat was brutal for these young soldiers. One testimony reflects how tough that day was. The Battle of Normandy was hell. We fought with all our might, but we were outnumbered and outgunned. The Allies attacked us from all directions, and we saw our friends die, and many of us were wounded. Still, we never lost faith in our cause and our Führer. We fought with bravery and determination, but in the end we were young people facing a much larger and more powerful war machine. The Battle of Normandy was an experience we will never forget, and although we lost, we never gave up. They faced massive bombings, tank attacks, and the relentless Allied offensive. They suffered high casualties due to their inexperience and the fierce Allied resistance. The division, although it managed to temporarily delay the Allied advance, could not change the course of the war on the Western Front. As the war neared its end, the situation of the 12th SS Panzer Division became desperate. In the final defense of Germany, these young fighters were involved in some of the bloodiest and most chaotic battles, including the defense of Berlin. Many of them died in combat, others were captured, and some tried to escape the imminent defeat. Parallel to the formation and deployment of the 12th SS Panzer Division, the Third Reich created the Volkssturm in October 1944 in a desperate attempt to mobilize the civilian population for the final defense of Germany. This popular militia was conceived when the war was clearly against Germany, and the Nazi regime sought to reinforce its lines with all available resources. The Volkssturm, known as the People's Storm, was composed of all German men between the ages of 16 and 60 who were not enrolled in active military service. This included teenagers who had not been recruited for units like the Hitler Youth, older men, and even those who had been deemed unfit for regular military service due to various reasons such as illnesses. The creation of the Volkssturm was announced by Joseph Goebbels, and the organization was quickly structured under the command of the Nazi Party. The structure and training of the Volkssturm were extremely rudimentary. Due to lack of time and resources, recruits received very little military training compared to the intensive training received by members of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Many of the Volkssturm were equipped with outdated or improvised weaponry and lacked the experience and discipline of regular soldiers. Despite these clear deficiencies, the Volkssturm was sent into battle on multiple fronts, especially in the defense of Berlin and other key cities against Allied and Soviet advances. In the defense of Berlin, its members were involved in extremely bloody and chaotic combat. Inexperienced young people, older men and civilians were sent to face much better equipped and trained enemy forces. Although some of its members showed notable courage, the lack of preparation and adequate equipment resulted in very high casualties and limited efficiency on the battlefield. With Germany's surrender in May 1945, this division ceased to exist, like the others. The survivors faced an uncertain future in a devastated country. During the denazification process carried out by the Allies, many of these young people were subjected to interrogations and in some cases trials for their participation in war crimes. They could only expect the worst for their future, a future snatched away by a handful of people in power. The Last Judgment, summary executions and swift justice in the twilight of the Reich. Hitler's final days were numbered, and concerns about the imminent downfall of the regime materialized as the weeks passed. As the Soviet Red Army advanced towards Berlin, many young Germans, including some members of the Hitler Youth, found themselves involved in the desperate defense of the German capital. These teenagers were mobilized to aid in the city's defense in a desperate attempt to halt the Soviet advance. The situation in Berlin was chaotic and dire. The Nazi regime had mobilized all available forces to defend the city at all costs. They were ordered to participate in building barricades, digging trenches, and fighting in the streets against the advancing enemy attack, one that rarely showed mercy. The fate of these soldiers was the darkest of all, as many died in combat, while others were captured by Soviet forces and sent to prisoner of war camps. With the official end of the war, the Hitler Youth militia disintegrated the moment Allied forces entered and dominated German territory. After the suicides of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Goebbels, and other high-ranking Nazi officials, there was nothing more to do. The Second World War had finally ended. The Allied forces were compelled to disarm these groups of young people because, despite their youth, many were highly trained and possessed considerable skill in handling weapons. Upon receiving news of the conflict's conclusion, which had stretched on for more than 6 long years, some militia members chose to surrender, while others, influenced by Nazi propaganda and ideology, refused to yield and fought to the death, following the orders of the Führer. Some near Hitler's bunker made efforts to secure the area using any available weapon or bomb, and their fervent desire to defend their leader bolstered their courage. They thought about the recognition this might bring them once the war ended, although this hope never materialized. Meanwhile, most adult soldiers chose to desert or surrender to Allied forces. After the conflict, great efforts were made to deprogram the young Germans who had been indoctrinated in Nazi ideology and to prevent any attempt to rearm the militia. Investigations were conducted to determine the individual responsibility of former members of the Hitler Youth for war crimes or human rights violations during the Nazi regime. Those identified as responsible for criminal actions were prosecuted and convicted in court, while others underwent re-education and rehabilitation programs to reintegrate them into democratic and demilitarized German society. Nevertheless, life had to go on in Germany in year 0, which faced a harsh present, but thanks to the efforts of the German people, it was able to improve year after year in a new political order that led the nation to glory, albeit not in the way the Nazi regime imagined, as they were able to maintain peace in the German country. During the Second World War, some teenage members of the Hitler Youth were executed, particularly in the conflict's final years, as the desperation of the Nazi regime increased and the war front collapsed. These executions were carried out by both German and Allied forces, although for different reasons and in different contexts. In 1945, as the war neared its end and the situation in Germany became increasingly desperate, summary executions became more frequent. The Nazi regime, under a strict policy of discipline and loyalty, executed those it deemed traitors or deserters. Young members of the Hitler Youth, many of them barely teenagers, were executed for attempting to desert or for refusing to participate in combat that was risky to their lives. These trials were summary, without due judicial process, and were carried out under the pressure of imminent defeat. One of the most notorious cases was that of the flying courts-martial, itinerant military tribunals that traveled near the front and made swift and severe decisions. Many young people, influenced by Nazi propaganda and the pressure of their superiors, faced the dilemma of fighting to the death or being executed for desertion. Allied forces, mainly Soviet, British and American, also carried out executions of Hitler Youth members. These were generally carried out in the context of German surrender in 1945 and were due to several factors. As they advanced towards Berlin, Allied troops, especially Soviet ones, encountered fierce resistance from the civilian population, including young members of the Hitler Youth. The brutality of the fighting and the atrocities committed by the Nazis during the war fueled desires for revenge. Many were summarily executed in retaliation for the actions of the Nazi regime. After Germany's surrender, the executions of young people seen as indoctrinated fanatics were carried out to establish control and deter any resistance or insurgency. With the fall of Berlin in 1945, Soviet forces encountered young fighters from the Hitler Youth in the city's last defenses. Many were summarily executed on the spot by the Soviets, who sought revenge and a quick pacification of the German capital. In some cases, Allied soldiers carried out executions of young prisoners in retaliation for the losses suffered and the fierce resistance, as in the Germany of Year Zero there was no law, much less punishment for the Allies, who were the winners of the war. These executions, especially those carried out by Allied forces, took place in a context of total war, where rules of engagement and the protection of prisoners of war were often disregarded. Summary trials prevailed until early 1946, and executions were carried out swiftly and coldly. Testimonies of cruelty, experiences of the Hitler Youth in World War II. The experiences of young recruits in the Hitler Youth reflect the brutal reality of a generation indoctrinated and sacrificed in the last years of the Third Reich. One of the most chilling accounts comes from Alfons Heck, who joined the organization at age 10 and quickly rose through its ranks. At 16, Heck was leading a group of teenagers in defending his town against the Allied advance. Nazi indoctrination had instilled in him an unwavering faith in the Reich's victory, even as defeat loomed. Under his command, these young people, without proper military training, faced numerically and equipment-wise superior Allied troops. Combat scenes were devastating. Many of his comrades fell around him, and Alphonse, burdened with the responsibility of his leadership, had to face the reality of sending children to their deaths. The mix of terror, despair, and the inevitable recognition of his own manipulation overtook Heck, marking his youth with unforgettable memories of death and destruction. His life was never the same after the war. Another testimony came from Melita Maschmann, a member of the League of German Girls, who had an equally disturbing experience. At 15, she was deeply indoctrinated and actively participated in propaganda activities and support for the war effort. In her autobiography, Maschmann describes how, during the Battle of Berlin, she was forced to attend to wounded soldiers, many of them only a few years older than her, some of whom died in her arms. The lack of medical supplies and widespread despair created an atmosphere of constant horror. Faced with the brutality of war and the dehumanization of those she had been taught to hate, Melita began to question the Nazi ideology she had previously accepted without reservation. Confronting the reality of death and suffering at such a young age left her with deep emotional scars and led to an internal conflict about her role in the war and the propaganda she had helped spread. Günter Lux, who was recruited into the Hitler Youth at 16, was sent to fight on the Eastern Front, one of the most brutal theaters of World War II. Without the necessary training and equipped with obsolete weapons, Lux and his young comrades found themselves in the midst of bloody battles against the Red Army. Günter vividly remembers an ambush in which his unit was decimated by Soviet forces, surrounded by the bodies of friends and comrades in arms, fighting for his life in an environment of absolute chaos. The brutality of combat, the extreme cold, and the lack of basic supplies made each day on the front lines a desperate struggle for survival. Lux survived, but the horrors he witnessed and the constant proximity to death left an indelible mark on his psychological state, transforming his youth into a living nightmare. These testimonies underscore the cruelty of the Hitler Youth experience. Their accounts not only illustrate the physical and emotional suffering they endured, but also the ideological manipulation that led them into a war they did not fully understand. The seriousness with which they narrate their experiences, devoid of exaggeration, reflects a harsh and painful truth, a generation sacrificed in the name of a destructive ideology. The history of these young people serves as a grim reminder of the consequences of indoctrination and war, and of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme circumstances. Numerous internationally renowned philosophers and thinkers have wondered how a culturally advanced nation like Germany could fall into the clutches of the ideology of hatred and violence embodied by Nazism. One possible explanation lies in the concept of national psychosis, which suggests a collective condition in which a society is immersed in a state of confusion and susceptibility to extreme ideological manipulation. In this context of social psychosis, the emergence of the Hitler Youth takes on particular relevance. The economic and social devastation following the First World War created fertile ground for the spread of resentment and exacerbated nationalism, resulting in the recruitment of children and young people instead of allowing them to enjoy a happy and peaceful childhood. This massive recruitment of children reflects the extent to which social psychosis had escalated, allowing Nazi propaganda and indoctrination to penetrate even the most vulnerable sphere of society, youth. Figures like Hegel, in his analysis of war as a means for asserting power and national identity, may have indirectly contributed to the ideological justification of militarism and aggression characteristic of the Nazi regime. Although Hegel did not directly advocate for war, he recognized its role in shaping political relations and forming the state. It is in this state of social psychosis where society, due to the circumstances of the post-war period, decided to entrust their lives to the Nazi regime, sacrificing even those of their own children and their future. Many members of these Nazi youth groups lived into old age, but a large percentage perished during the course of World War II. Young people aged 14 to 18 lost their lives on the battlefield, in the ranks and in the trenches at the height of the conflict. They were born and died for war, as if they were mere pawns on a chessboard.